Hello and welcome everybody. We're really glad that you can join this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar, which, as you know, is dealing with investigating conflict-related sexual violence. My name is Juliana Rufus. I'm the host of the session today, and it's a topic that's really close to my heart. I'm a filmmaker and investigative journalist. I have worked for Al Jazeera, the BBC, and others. And I have made films either dealing with conflict-related sexual violence and the quest for accountability, or touching on it involving in Bosnia, in Colombia, and the Congo. I'm now also working for the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and the Dart Center has developed some specific resources and material on this topic, and you'll hear more about that later. So, the context for our discussion is conflict and war, and we want to point out, which is really important, that the impact of crimes of sexual violence are not only felt by individuals, but also by families and communities. And it's really important to understand that there can be destructive consequences that persist for generations. And reporting criminal acts during conflicts is never easy. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience have worked on this, and active conflicts are tough, but reporting on sexual violence is particularly full of challenges. So what we want to discuss today with our panelists is how sexual violence in conflict can be understood. That's how we start. Then we'll look also at some of the most common misconceptions about this type of violence. And we'll speak about how, where, and how journalists, particularly investigative journalists, can fit in. We have some really amazing panelists who will offer some tips and resources on how to investigate effectively, how to safely engage with survivors and contributors, and how to navigate the call for justice. So I'm going to start with introducing all of them, and then you will hear from them, and their work will also speak for itself. The first person is Alex Wilma, who is joining us from, are you in Brussels, Alex?
In The Hague.
In The Hague, okay. And you are a senior advocacy advisor and program manager at the Women's Initiative for Gender Justice. Alex, you have over 10 years of experience in monitoring the work of International Criminal Court for the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, also for Human Rights Watch and Open Society Justice Initiative. You have also led NGO advocacy campaigns on gender justice and the IOC. So you really are our legal expert here on this issue. Then we also have Lauren Wolf, and Lauren, you are joining us from America. You're an award-winning journalist and photographer. You're wearing so many hats. I looked at your profile, and that alone could fill 5 minutes, but you're a contributing writer for Washington Monthly. You are the publisher of Chills, and you are an adjunct professor at New York University Graduate School of Journalism. Lauren, we've invited you to the session because you have also created and directed a project that is called Women Under Siege, womenundersiegeproject.org, which is a journalism initiative on sexualized violence in conflict. And it originates by Gloria Steinem at the Women's Media Center. So you're both a journalist, but you also have an academic background. And then finally, we have Gavin Rees, who is the Senior Advisor for Training and Innovation at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. And Gavin, you're the former director of Dart Center Europe. You were responsible at the Dart Center for implementing sorry, I'm going to switch here. Gavin, you have been working on trauma awareness and as a consultant and trainer for the Dart Center in newsrooms and media support organizations and journalism schools for over 15 years. Recently, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, that's fair.
Recently, your work has focused on developing new approaches to working safely with traumatic images. You have created resources dealing with online harassment, and also on working ethically and effectively with victims and survivors of profound human rights abuses, and that includes forced labor, torture, and sexual violence. So today's topic. And before I get us into the conversation, I just want to let you know, have you a bit more information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Most of you know about GIJN anyway, and that's why you're here. But it's a really fantastic organization. It's the largest global network for non-profit investigative journalism, with over 235 member organizations in 89 countries. And it works with journalists everywhere, in nonprofits, in commercial organizations, and with freelancers. If you ever need any extra skills during an investigation, the GIJN website, which is gijn.org, has an amazing amount of resources and tip sheets, and it's incredibly easy getting lost on the website, just all the advice there is on offer. So I do urge you to have a look. And just a little bit more about the context of today's webinar. Over the coming months, GIJN will be hosting a series of webinars on investigating war crimes, and this is the first. Like all the others, this webinar will be recorded and it will get posted on YouTube. Another quick reminder, which is that we have live interpretation from English to French and Russian and Spanish. And if you would like to have this live interpretation service, please click on the interpretation button and select the language that you prefer. And then finally, and this time I really mean finally, we do want to hear from everybody who is watching the webinar today. We would really, really like to invite you to write with questions and messages in the Q&A box. We'll try and get as many of them in as we can. You can start posting from now, basically, and GIJN's Emily O'Sullivan will help us moderate. You have heard enough for me, and I would like to hand over to Alex now. I know Alex is going to get us started with getting an understanding of what conflict-related sexual violence actually means. I think we're getting a bit of a legal context for this, and as you can see, Alex has prepared some slides.
Well, thank you very much, Juliana, and thank you very much for having me today to present indeed on what I consider some of the basics of investigating conflict-related sexual violence. As Juliana indicated, I work with Women's Initiatives for Gender Justice. We are a Dutch-based NGO, international human rights NGOs, that works towards gender equality and accountability for sexual violence through international criminal law, among others. Before I dive into the topic, I would like to note the following. First of all, it's not an easy topic. It's really quite a difficult topic, and I will be, and I'm sure the speakers after me as well, be mentioning some graphic examples. If you feel that at any stage it gets a bit too much for you, don't hesitate to log out. And I need to apologize for those who are here with interpretation. My slides are only in English. So let me then dive in. Sexual violence in conflict, what are the basics? What I will discuss with you today is the context of conflict, the gender dynamics that are at play when looking at conflict-related sexual violence, some basic principles of conflict-related sexual violence. I will discuss with you the sexual in sexual violence, how sexual violence, one of the big misconceptions, is not only rape, why it is all important to have this basic understanding and context, and some of the main obstacles to reporting conflict-related sexual violence. I will also quickly mention how conflict-related sexual violence never happens in isolation from other incidents and harms, particularly in conflict. So when looking at the very basics of sexual violence, the most important one is where there is conflict or where mass atrocity crimes are committed, there will be sexual violence, always. another premise to keep in mind is that sexual violence is by far not only rape. I'll come back to that at a later stage. Sexual violence is also not a byproduct of war. A big misconception is that sexual violence happens because soldiers are frustrated, boys will be boys, it just happens. It's not. That's the next point. Sexual violence in conflict is an intentional and deliberate way of attacking a population, or how it's sometimes called as well, is a real weapon of war. And the last point is sexual violence is widespread. Now, this is crucial to remember because for a very, very long time, in any context really, sexual violence crimes were not recognized as crimes in themselves. They were not recognized as independent national or international crimes, such as crimes constituting genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. And thus they were very rarely recognized, reported on, and prosecuted before tribunals. And this was based on many things, but also a persistent misunderstanding about the nature and the occurrence of sexual violence. And these misunderstandings still exist and may lead to major gaps in truth finding and later on in getting to justice in seeing those crimes at trial. So let's unpack that a little bit. This webinar is about conflict-related sexual violence, also known under its acronym CRSV. Now, as many of you may know, sexual violence is widespread in peacetime, and this is exacerbated in times of conflict or when mass atrocity is committed. So when addressing conflict-related sexual violence, we're not talking about sexual violence that happens by coincidence during conflict. We're not talking about sexual violence that happens in peacetime. We're talking about sexual violence that happens because of a conflict, because atrocities are being committed. This is quite crucial as the context of the conflict is what makes it a violation of national or international criminal law. The next point I would like to discuss are some of the gender dynamics. CRSV builds on pre-existing gender dynamics within a society, be it of the victim or of the perpetrator. When you go into a situation, carrying out a gender analysis will tell you who exactly is at a higher risk of sexual violence, and this will help you to identify potential victims. It will also allow you to show the contextual elements of a crime, the motive of a perpetrator, any discriminatory intent, for example. It will also help explain why certain forms of sexual violence that you may encounter are perpetrated against men or are perpetrated against children. It will help to put that into context. In any situation, really any situation or country, there has been usually excellent research done by civil society or the UN or researchers or others as to the gender dynamics of a relevant society, and that can be easily found online. This gender frame is now crucially important to understand our next point, which is, okay, what is conflict-related sexual violence then? As I said before, it's not an easy topic to navigate. It's not the most comfortable topic to discuss. And it is important to be honest with ourselves about that, as there are so many unintentional biases, personal prejudice about sexuality, and thus about sexual violence that live in all of us, and let alone deeply entrenched gendered frameworks and ideas about that sexuality that we each and all have. So I say that to then come to a number of very clear and basic principles that build on the ones that I mentioned before. What is then conflict-related sexual violence? They are acts of a sexual of sexual violence that are intentional, they're non-consensual, and they're acts of a sexual nature. CRSV is sexual violence which occurs during and is related to a conflict. This can include non-physical acts. I'll come back on that later. It can also be committed by or against any person, regardless of age, of sex, or of gender. So I just said acts of sexual violence are acts of a sexual nature. When you listen closely, that doesn't really explain to you what then sexual means, and that's a crucial point. As I said at the beginning, sexual violence is not synonymous with rape. There is, unfortunately, an enormous breadth of violent acts that may constitute sexual violence. And not understanding them, not recognizing them, is missing a very large part of the picture. So what is sexual about sexual violence? According to who is it sexual? Is it according to the victim or is it according to the perpetrator? Is it according to the community of either one? Is it sexual to the judge or the prosecutor? And why does this matter? We did some in-depth research about this, and answers that we found that are common to the perception of hundreds of survivors that we interviewed, survivors of sexual violence, and also we looked at international law and practice. These are the certain common denominators. Whether an act is sexual in nature is rooted in the perception of the victim, or it can be rooted in the perception of a perpetrator and or of their respective communities. An act may be deemed to be sexual in nature regardless whether it produced or was intended to produce sexual gratification for the perpetrator. Sexual violence does not necessarily have to cause physical injury. It doesn't even have to be physical at all. I'll give some examples later. And sexual violence can be committed against a person, against persons. It can be committed by causing a person to engage in the act with the perpetrator or with themselves or with a third party. So let me explain this by giving examples. I have three categories: examples involving physical contact, no physical contact, and examples based on fear and or sexual humiliation. Sexual violence is not only rape, but let's start with that. It can be an act involving penetration, which can be vaginal or anal, by a sexual organ or body part or an object. It can be, these lists are not exhaustive. It can be genital mutilation. It can be violence related to menstruation. It can be virginity testing. It can be punishment. It can be forcibly undressing somebody or imposing forced nudity. Examples that do not involve physical contact can be sexual harassment, can be coercion to share intimate photos or videos. It can be recording of consensual or forced sexual intercourse, being exposed to nudity, being exposed to sexually explicit language. What is not on this list is being exposed to acts of sexual violence. That is very important, that we see in conflict over and over again. And then there's our examples based on fear or humiliation. The imminent threat of sexual violence is something that is seen time and time over. Being forced to defecate or urinate in front of others is deemed by many survivors to be sexual in nature. Being forced to dress as another gender, being forced to use toilet facility designed in a way that genitals are exposed to others, or being forced to witness acts of sexual violence, as I said before, is an act of sexual violence itself. So why is this all important? Knowing this will allow you to have and report on a full picture of the conflict, but also a full picture of sexual violence beyond rape. It will allow to understand and report on the lack of understanding itself, the lack of understanding of practitioners, be it police, lawyers, judges, politicians, NGOs, you name it, as to what sexual violence in conflict is. And it will allow you to recognize the extent to which survivors of sexual violence, because of all of this, are marginalized, not listened to, and thus have very, very little hope for help, assistance, justice, or reparations. I'm getting to the end of my presentation. Let me mention the following things with you, because it is something that you will, if you investigate conflict-related sexual violence, will encounter, and they are obstacles to reporting CRSV. In any conflict, but also in peacetime, the majority of acts of sexual violence are not reported to the police or not documented otherwise. Underreporting by victims of sexual violence in conflict particularly occurs for various reasons. They are on their occupation, meaning that there are no avenues whatsoever. For those who are in territory that is recently liberated, there are massive issues of impunity and distrust, the lack of institutions or services or systems to address such violence, a reluctance or unwillingness on the part of criminal justice actors to initiate investigations for a variety of reasons, the view of investigators and prosecutors that there's a need for corroborating evidence when investigating sexual violence. It's a massive misperception and untruth that persists in many, many jurisdictions. There's the fear of retaliation and stigma. That is huge. The fear of reprisals by the own community. The fear of stigma when sexual violence survivors are shunned or frowned upon by their own community. We all know the, what were you wearing? What were you doing? How were you conducting yourself? Because of fear of not being believed. That is very common. When there are no physical traces, for example, it's my word against his, against theirs. Maybe I won't be believed. There's victim blaming, as I said before. There are societal norms and expectations that lead to victim blaming. Trauma, not only from the act of sexual violence itself, but also stemming from the bombings of homes and cities, hiding in bunkers for days, etc. Further, there is a very real level of distrust in authorities, including the police, social workers, medical professionals, etc. This is to explain, not to discourage. Bringing these challenges to light is more than just about sort of the number of cases brought forward or the number of articles written about this. At the end of the day, to me, but I'm an NGO activist, it's really also about facilitating the identification and successful prosecution. It's about greater awareness of the public consciousness of the need to better understand and enable access to justice for survivors. My last point is conflict-related sexual violence never happens in isolation from other incidents and harms. They're never a standalone crime. And there are many early warning indicators or red flags that you can be on the lookout for. For example, disappearance, evacuation, house raids and searches. When there is proliferation of weapons and small arms, red flag, sexual violence will be on the rise. When there's detention at camps or at checkpoints, when there are movement of troops after victory and defeat, red flag, sexual violence on the rise. The proximity of armed groups to civilian centers or areas, frequent forays to villages by individuals or group of soldiers, looting and pillaging, all red flags. Very often, victims will not discuss with you immediately or directly sexual violence, But if you're mindful of these red flags, when you're talking about a woman whose house has been pillaged, she's discussing this with you, be aware that if you ask her, were there other people around? What time of day was it? That you're on a path to making it maybe more easy for her to disclose to you, that indeed there might be sexual violence that has occurred. Oh, I'm sorry, this one. The work that I presented on, the research that we have done, can be found along with many, many other examples and indicators of sexual violence in a resource that is called the Hague Principles on Sexual Violence that you can easily find online. That's it for me for now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Alex. That was incredibly useful. The red flags, very useful, what to be aware of, but also your definition of what sexual violence actually is. There was a lot in there that really broadened my thinking. I just wanted to say thanks also for drawing attention to the resources. This is quite a difficult topic. You heard me stumble over a couple of terms earlier on. And GIJN has been working on putting some resources together. So if you're listening, but if you also know that you want to look something up later on, you will get an email. If you signed up for this talk, you will get an email afterwards with resources from the speaker. And also, as always, see questions popping up, keep asking. So the next speaker is Lauren Wolf. Lauren, we've heard a bit about you in my introduction earlier on. You're a journalist with an amazing body of work specialized in sexual violence. And I know you have prepared some slides for us, drawing on examples from Congo and Ukraine. But before we get to that, I saw you nodding earlier on when Alex was speaking. There is this age-old thing that gets asked and sometimes upsets people, the difference between an activist and a journalist. And Alex spoke quite clearly about being an activist. So, you know, maybe the obvious question is, but should journalists become agents for accountability? Is it our job to investigate and bring to justice sexual violence, or are we just journalists whose job it is to write and describe? You've done so much work on it. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Juliana. Hi, everyone. First, I just want to say this is really exciting to see so many of you from every part of the world here. So thanks for coming. In terms of the activist journalist kind of thing, I think people get confused that there are people who cover politics, there are people who cover human rights. It's not just a one size fits all, never ever try to make something right. You know, I feel like in the kind of work that I do, reporting on war crimes and sexualized violence, you are automatically writing about something horrible that needs to change. So if you can just reveal it, that to me is working toward change. I happen to get kind of involved in my cases and end up sort of following the push to justice, and in one case became part of the process, which I'll talk about. Excuse me one second.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I will open up my slides and yeah, here, one second. I'm just gonna try to figure everything out. Okay, let's see, share screen. Okay, and oops. Okay, so the reason I have this first slide, first do no harm. It is my guiding principle in reporting on these issues, and it's more than one issue, as Alex said. And I am going to speak about this in terms of reporting in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I did for about 7 years, and reporting on Syria I did for 3-4 years. So, oops, sorry, it's speeding. This is the DRC case, and I wanted to first give you some background because it is very unknown, unfortunately. You can read about it in The Guardian. You can read about how I did it on Chills, how I did the story in every step. So what was happening was I first heard about it in 2014, I think, when I was first in Congo. And a human rights worker told me that there had been babies being raped, just a few of them, like 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. And I was just like, what is this? That is horrifying. But there was very little known about it. I ended up going back home and checking in every once in a while. And about 6 months after the first few, it started happening again. And it kept happening. So in the end, there were about almost 50 girls aged 18 months to 11 years old, or 12, you'll see, but that's because that was after her rape. But they were being kidnapped from their shacks. And it was a very poor village. Actual shacks, some didn't even have doors, some just had a curtain, but there would be like many people in the house, a lot of children. So the girls would be taken during the night, gang raped, and left somewhere, like in a field. No one was investigating it. No one was, except, international NGOs were paying attention, but in terms of the Congolese government, they just were ignoring the whole thing. So I decided the only way to really do this story was to go back. So that is the context. Some crazy bits of the story is it did turn out that the man who was organizing the rapes was a member of parliament. And he and his men had a kind of loose militia, and they believed in sorcery. So they were told by a kind of witch doctor type person, sorcerer person, that they should rape little girls because it will give them power to be impervious to bullets and all sorts of things. Okay, so it's madness. Because this in particular was a very difficult story to report because it was children and it was very, very dangerous in their particular village, it was very important to me to find a way to speak to the families and the girls that would not be detected, by authorities. So I also just wanted to start on the fact that do go through local groups to find a safe survivor to speak to. So not only in that case did I work with local NGOs, obviously I knew who the survivors were to speak to, but in the Syria context, it could be extremely dangerous to just sort of walk into a refugee camp and like, you don't know what you're doing. So if you have people who are working locally, they can help you find someone where it's not going to put them at danger. They will help arrange a meeting. They will make sure that that person understands what's happening, that they're willing to do the interview. So there's the age-old thing where some of us may have heard about, where someone goes into a refugee area and just starts shouting, has anyone here been raped? I was hearing that in Ukraine over the summer, even again, and it's something I've been hearing for years. And it did apparently happen. I always forget if it was in Congo or somewhere. It was somewhere, I think, in Central Africa. Okay. Do protect your source, digitally and otherwise. It depends on what country you're working in, whether you have to really worry about digital protection, but your cell phone can actually lead authorities to the person you're speaking to. You know what I mean? If they can track you in a sophisticated country. So if you're in Jordan doing that, yeah, they could be following you, and then you're taking them right to the person that they don't want speaking. In a place like Congo, they're following you around, but they don't actually have the technology to do that kind of thing. And as I wrote, would you rather get someone killed or tell the story with a pseudonym? So that I will speak more about how to write about sexualized violence and protect people. Okay, so do let your source lead the telling, but also reroute back to the details you need to gather in order to tell the story well. When I said do no harm, I think of this kind of journalism as the opposite of most kinds of journalism, in that you really have to let your source lead the interview. You're not sort of hounding them with questions, or, it's not like you're pressing them too hard. They have to kind of feel comfortable to tell you this very traumatic thing that happened to them. So you may need to get certain things while you're during the interview, but you may have to do it over a longer period than you would like, or, a few interviews, but you can reroute back. You just have to kind of give yourself the time, give the person the time. When I say do get context, you want to know if this is happening to other people. And, this is partly how the survivors in Congo all found each other. There was just a lot of like talking back and forth, and no one was able to pinpoint the perpetrator, what we later did. But in terms of, say, in Syria, if you have, or Ukraine, if you have one woman who says that she's been raped in this particular town, you can ask questions like, what was the man wearing? What was the soldier wearing? What were the insignias on there? Different kinds of things that will point to the fact that maybe this is happening elsewhere. You can use that information. So getting the context is very important. You also want to get the cultural context, because as Alex said, it is extremely taboo in many cultures to be raped. And I think that's why rape as a weapon of war is so effective, especially in Syria, because it's the kind of thing where if a woman is raped, the entire family may feel shame, or in Congo, same thing. So basically you're hitting all of the community by raping women in such cultures. Also, legal context, understand, you want to know how a crime against humanity or a war crime legally can be tried, because the way you're reporting and telling the story can actually help further that. And that's not activism in my mind. That's just sort of working to right something terrible. When I say do follow up, I really hate the idea of someone telling me such a very terrible story, and then I write about them and they never hear from me again or see the story that they appeared in. So I've had my stories translated into Arabic, into French, and I work with my sources to get the women, or sometimes men, who've been violated, so that they can see what I wrote, they can respond. I like to keep in touch with people. I think it's too much to just kind of swoop in, get a story, and then, that's it. You also want to follow up on, there's more stories there. What's happening with their mental health? Like, what's happening with the legal cases? Like, are they getting medical care? And in the case of the girls in Congo, it's like an ongoing issue even now, years. So it's been like 10 years, I guess, almost 8 years, I guess. And they're still dealing, with severe trauma. These were little girls. So it is something that, and also my sources around these girls, the civil society leader, finally the investigator who was put on the case, just so many people. I've followed up with them sort of nonstop over the years, and many of them have faced threats, and I've helped them flee the country because of this whole thing. So I feel like you have more of a responsibility maybe than, I don't know, than a lot of people may feel. But this is just to show you, when I was talking about those shacks, this is a kitchen actually in this very, very poor village of Kavumu where the girls were being raped. So just to show you. And then some don'ts. When I said don't rush a survivor, when I was reporting on Syria at the Turkish border, there was a 14-year-old girl in a hospital right over the border in Turkey who had been tortured and raped. And I was planning to speak to her, and I was told, by this local NGO, sure, she's going to speak to you. But then in the time when I got there to the time the interview was supposed to happen, a well-known international journalist actually swooped in and interviewed her so badly, apparently, that she was incredibly re-traumatized. I mean, I'm not going to totally blame the reporter, because you don't know what actually happened in the room, but what I was told is she really rushed, she really pushed the girl, and the girl would not speak to any more reporters. So it's really important to do what the cultural setting requires, and just study up on trauma, how you interview, how you don't re-traumatize someone. When I say don't crowd them, be respectful. Photographers, videographers, I've seen, it's just people can be very in your face in those areas. And Also, I've gotten many offers as an editor over the years of photos of survivors. And this is where it gets to consent, because I feel that people take these images and the women themselves don't necessarily understand what it means, that their face may be shown, you know? So there are ways to take beautiful photos without showing a face. But also, I've witnessed over the years, I had a photographer tell one woman that actually in Zatari refugee camp, I saw we have someone from Jordan here, that don't worry, this will only appear, you know, in the US and like Western Europe, because if the stories we were doing were going to appear in print, yeah, okay, fine, it might be for a Western news outlet, but anyone knows, we all know, the internet means it goes everywhere. So it's a lie to say that everyone won't see it if they want to. So you have to realize, though, like the girls in Congo had never seen a computer. You know, I was showing them my computer and they certainly didn't understand what it meant, right? So you want to kind of make that clear. You don't want to just assume they know what you're talking about. It's really, you know, you're the person who understands how media truly works. And then a quick story about a woman I was reporting on in a Jordanian hospital. I did the interview by Skype. She was a survivor of multiple rapes and torture because she was part of the Free Syrian Army. So this was quite a while ago. And she had had her neck broken with a rifle butt and she was paralyzed completely. So she was sort of wasting away in this hospital, but she wanted badly to speak out about her rape. So I did an interview with her. She sent me photos of herself. You know, she said, please use my full name and show my face. And no one had done that yet in Syria. I still don't think anyone's done that really. But again, it was one of those things of like, does she understand what that means? So I explained, and, you know, I really was struggling of like, I want to be able to put a face and a name to this because it's really important to make people care. But I don't want to in any way hurt her. And as I spoke to NGO people, they said, well, does she have family in Syria? And she did. She had children there. And the people on that side of the fence were like, you can't do this, like they'll get killed if you publish all that. But a journalist who'd worked in Bosnia, who had, you know, really put the idea of like rape camps on the map, he told me, you have to, like, this is the only way people start to care. In the end, I only published a photo of her hands, and here you can see, this is Alma. I'm showing you this. She actually died a year later, but I showed a photo of her hands, and I only used her middle and last name, I believe. Part of what went into my consideration was that getting context idea. When I spoke to her doctors, her psychiatrist, apparently she was on a ton of morphine and, you know, different painkillers, and she was suicidal. And she eventually did starve herself to death. Like she just did refuse food and water in the end. So I figured, you know what, this is not a decision that she can make properly, I think, in a like a drug-induced state. So I felt comfortable, you know, being more cautious. But I also want to, oh, sorry about that. I want to talk about a little bit about evidence. And, you know, for someone like Alma, she does have, well, did have scars and different things around her genitals that would show there was some trauma there. And I think, as Alex was saying, it's like, well, you didn't quite say like always believe the victim or survivor, but I do feel in this reporting that, you know, if you hear a man is tortured in Ukraine, you don't really go, did that really happen? Somehow we're still in the age of like, I don't think that happened when it comes to rape. So if you start on the side of, yes, it did happen, and then work to corroborate that, I think you're more on track, because yes, this is a hidden crime, but it is happening in every conflict. As Alex said, it's always there. So in terms of evidence, you know, the girl in the excuse me, the girl in the hospital in Turkey, you know, she had cigarette burns and other sorts of torture signs. She was so traumatized. I mean, you talk to doctors, talk to psychologists, you also find out what was happening in that particular area at that particular time. You know, did soldiers sort of invade that village at that time that she says she was raped? You know, is this a pattern that you're seeing? Another thing that's been really interesting for me over the years is learning that if you can pinpoint certain types of language that soldiers are saying sort of during rape, it seems it's happening in Ukraine, it happened in Syria, it happened in Zimbabwe in the post-election violence. You can start to identify whether this is possibly something ordered from above, you know, command responsibility, or is this just happening because soldiers are, you know, taking advantage of a situation or just trying to humiliate people. But sometimes it is sort of a do this to them kind of order. So for instance, in Syria, tracking rape, I was hearing stories where they kept saying like, you want freedom, like, you know, I'll give you your freedom, that kind of thing. But that could also just be like part of the culture that was going on with Assad's soldiers. Same as in Ukraine, I'm starting to hear, you know, women are being called fascists, Nazis, prostitutes. You know, there are a couple phrases being said, but again, there's been this propaganda campaign by Putin for years. So that who knows if that's a pattern or not, right? I mean, a command pattern. Let's see. So yeah, the last point is don't sensationalize, and that starts in the interview. And as it says here, people will talk because they know they want you, they want to please you sometimes. But that doesn't mean you should push, because like I said, this girl who was 14 years old, she just melted down if you push too hard. And you can actually ask too much about the attack, you know, get the gory details. So how much is enough and how much is too much? I think that it's not necessary to describe, you know, the horror, painful, physical bits possibly. Usually you don't have to do that, but if you can kind of talk about what the soldiers said during the rape and like give, you know, the context around what was happening, that's important to show. I think that's about it. Yeah, I was just ending on this photo of this little girl. This is just a Russian tank by the side of the road near Bucha in Ukraine. And as I'm sort of monitoring the situation, I am hearing more and more reports of rape. So as with every war and as with Russians, we know they did this in Syria and they're doing it again. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really great to have such strong practical insights and tips. And I know that Gavin will actually pick up on quite a few of them in a minute. I do actually have questions as well. Let's see how it goes time-wise. I'm going to continue with Gavin just so that we stay on time, and then we'll see afterwards how it goes with the Q&A. What was great, Lauren, just now is that you've already touched on two things: how not to do harm when it comes to contributors, but also the responsibility that you take on when it comes to, I don't know if aftercare is the right word, but certainly staying in touch with interviewees over time. Now that is also can be quite a burden on a journalist, and I know that Gavin is going to speak on both things in a bit more depth with a set of slides based on a resource that the Dart Centre put together with the help of the British Foreign Office, I think. Gavin, do you want to have a go and then we get to questions afterwards?
Yeah, sure. Let me share my screen in that case. And great, can everybody see a slide? And new slide? Good, great. Just double check it's working. So really, I mean, everybody, all my sort of in awe really of the previous speakers. They've given very rich accounts of things that we need to think about. And so particularly from picking up from Alex was the importance of preparation and understanding the context and understanding that there are different levels of sexual violence, which actually also, of course, creates opportunities for storytelling as well. There may be aspects of sexual violence that people are more willing to talk about than other things. They may be very averse to talking about penetration, but they may find it easier to talk about public humiliation because it has a social context and perhaps they weren't the only person and so forth. So lots of things to think there about story selection. So really what I'm here to do is to introduce this resource, because what it does is it goes over very many of the things that Alex and Lauren have talked about, and particularly practical things that Lauren have talked about, and it converts them into checklists. And I know investigative journalists love checklists. It's also available in multiple languages. I sound like I'm selling it. And that's very useful as well, because it raises another issue that we haven't talked about, is that often journalists are working in cross-cultural contexts, and they may be working with translators or local producers who haven't done this kind of interviewing before. So there's an opportunity to share resources with those. And of course, that was primarily translated into local languages, including Ukrainian, Swahili, Arabic, Burmese, and Amharic, in order to share resources with journalists who are doing local journalists who are bearing the real burden of the work. So it's a series of checklists. One is, am I sufficiently prepared for working on this kind of project? So Lauren mentioned the importance of making sure that you're doing a risk assessment for the sources protection. So if you're going somewhere remote where your phone can be tracked, or you're traveling back across a border with a whole bunch of stuff on your phone, then part of the preparation phase is making sure that you've done all of the kind of digital security stuff and you thought that through. Do you ever need to write this person's name down on a piece of paper anywhere? Can you give them a code name, or a set of initials, or a different name, whatever it is, something that you need to think about beforehand, perhaps. And a classic one that people don't tend to think about is visual choices. So if somebody's been told that they must get pictures beforehand, turning up in a conflict area, short of time, and then kind of rushing around and taking pictures, you might come back with a whole bunch of pictures that it's very easy for somebody forensically to identify where that village or that town or that house was. So a classic situation is that people taking pictures of Yazidi women with their faces covered, but they were wearing hyper distinctive shawls and everybody in the community could recognize them by their shawls. So some journalists doing that kind of reporting in a preparation phase might go and buy the plainest, most common shawl that you could possibly imagine and ask somebody to wear that, if that's the kind of photo choice that you want to take. And also, how are we depicting people? So we're depicting people in isolation. The stock image of somebody who is almost kind of destroyed or uncontrollably emotional, maybe that's actually not the person's reality. Maybe they might be like that, perhaps when we're talking to them about their torture, but in other phases of their life, they're keeping things together and they're coping as well as they can do, given what's happened to them. So thinking about representation, and there are a whole bunch of things there. So a lot of the stuff that I was going to talk about has already been picked up. So Laura mentioned this, the crucial thing about, do I have enough time to contain this interview, to make somebody feel secure? Do I need to do this in one go? Can I come back several times? Is it a longer process of building rapport and building understanding? And a really crucial one is to do the kind of political homework. So some real journalistic errors, mistakes happened in the reporting of Yazidi women who were basically forced into sexual prostitution by ISIS and other militia groups. One of the things was the title. So these stories are often called ISIS brides, which is an extremely unfortunate term that shouldn't have been used. I can see Laura nodding there, and I'm sure other people as well, we can see the difficulty with that. But one of the biggest problems happened there was an issue around informed consent. So some women agreed to speak to journalists. Journalists thought, wow, this is brave and courageous that they're willing to share their experiences. They did their interviews, and then only at a later date, found out that elders in the community had instructed the women to speak. And they did so in full knowledge that the shame of public advocacy would make it probably impossible, or it's very hard for them ever to marry in the future. Indeed, some of these women had to leave the communities that they were in, and they did it for a political purpose, because they wanted to, the elders rather, because they wanted to attract diplomatic and economic support to their communities in different ways. So this is the importance of doing the homework on that kind of context. I want to talk a little bit about kind of trauma. Trauma is a very kind of complicated area. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I just want to kind of key into a couple of kind of really simple ideas. And one is that when we're exposed to trauma, it could be sexual assault or other kinds of violence, our body, which in many ways is very wise, kicks into emergency mode. And it does all kinds of extraordinary things. We can become hyper aware of threats in the environment. We can absorb a lot of detail, a lot of information. The body might decide, particularly it's what quite often happens in the cases of sexual assault, to go floppy, a bit dissociative. So one isn't kind of fighting, one kind of automatically relaxes. And the body wants to do that because it's a very effective way of protecting somebody against worse injuries. And so it makes a judgment call and it flips in that direction. But the problem is that we don't understand our reactions, or we don't tend to understand our reactions in detail. And so it can be very hard for people to make sense of what happened. And one other thing I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail is that memory operates differently. So when we're being attacked, we're not thinking about, well, what am I going to tell a journalist in 2-3 weeks later on? I need to remember this in chronology. Basically, the brain is recording kind of warning signals. It's not working in an intellectual way at all. And it kind of might mix all those details back together in a way that isn't chronologically or linearly active. It may also, our brains and bodies may also suppress information. So that information might be very hard to retrieve. So if you're thinking about somebody who's been attacked, then what the survivor has to do, or they might, by the way, prefer to be called a victim. Sometimes people don't like to be called survivors, they prefer to be called victims. And sometimes if you call somebody victims, they prefer to be called survivors. So this is a kind of crucial point about things, is that it's really important to ask people what terminology that they would prefer to use. Sometimes it's very hard for people to make sense of what's happened to them. They can't remember things, they feel ashamed. And how people make sense of these experiences is often through social support in the community and through the feeling of being understood. And at the moment, there's the issue around anonymity, which is really, really important. I think most journalists need to presume that victims and survivors of sexual assault in conflict need to be anonymous. But further down the line, you might come across people who are in survivors groups who are working together, who themselves have more of a kind of advocacy orientation. But at the moment, particularly thinking about Ukraine, which is happening now, is the presumption has to be to preserve people's anonymity and to assume that that's probably going to be in their best interests. So memory is not a recording. And so that means that when we're interviewing people, it may be unfair to overly rely on a single source to get the account right. And if there are holes in the account, things that don't quite make sense, it doesn't mean that the person is lying or has any intent to deceive. It may just mean that they can't put those fragments, those hot fragments of experience back together in a clear way. The important thing to be aware of in this is that even if we interview somebody 4 or 5 months later, or maybe years after an incident has happened, just talking about trauma can bring back some of the same reactions. So you might see somebody in an interview getting a bit nervous, looking around the room, not sure that they're safe. They might go a bit kind of hazy and as if they're not really there, a little bit dissociative. That doesn't mean that we're re-traumatizing them, by the way. What that means is that those natural experiences that they've had are coming back. What re-traumatizing is interviewing somebody in a rush, breaking promises, saying you're going to protect somebody's anonymity and they're not doing it, saying invalidating things that increase the sense of shame, those kinds of things can potentially re-traumatize. But just somebody re-experiencing or telling their story isn't quite the same thing. Clear about that. So we've talked about meaningful consent. I don't really need to go into that in any detail. Lauren's covered it in well. Do people understand that they might appear on social media in different formats as well? That's another thing to think about. Classic framing is that trauma takes away control and agency from people. And so during the interview, the question is, what can we do to restore that or to give some of that back? And that's about creating a kind of protective container. So maybe starting off very clear ground rules, perhaps checking that to find out what they're willing to talk about and not willing to talk about. Are there any details they'd rather not go into, or any experiences or periods of time that might be a bit too much to talk about at this session? Acknowledging that talking may be difficult. Classic open framing question. So what can you tell me about ... That gives somebody the opportunity to volunteer and start with things that they feel secure and that they know that they can talk about. If you ever hear a really good trauma clinician working with a client, one of the things they're absolutely brilliant at is constantly rechecking permissions. So they'll kind of smuggle into the conversation things like, do you mind if it's okay if we talk about this? Or how would it be if I do this? And they almost do it as if they're breathing. It's kind of part of the conversation. Therapists also have this very useful idea called the rule of 3/3, which is very useful for going back and revisiting a traumatic event that isn't fresh in the sense of, happened last week or a few days ago. And so the first third of the interview, we'd focus on a time that person felt stable before before the conflict happened or whenever it was. They ask them to describe themselves and what their life was like, so forth. Then you kind of go to the events that led up to the attack or the assault or whatever you're investigating in terms of sexual violence. Give as much space as possible for the person to talk. And then the last third of the interview is back on now. It's on present functioning. What are they doing? Maybe they've done up their house. It doesn't really matter. But anything that means that you're not walking out of the door with that person really in the center of the worst things that happen to them. So there's a time to kind of decompress and wrap things up as well. I'll be very careful about interrogative questions, like particularly why questions, because police use why questions. Like, I think we've already alluded to it. The idea of like, why were you wearing those clothes? Or why were you alone? Why weren't you protected by other people? They're usually poor questions to ask. There's no need to ask people how they feel if feeling is already in the conversation. If you ask people how they feel, you tend to accelerate their feelings, and that can make it harder to contain the conversation. We're running a bit short of time, but you might come across people, of course, who in this kind of situation have really quite unpleasant feelings of kind of vengeance or revenge or certain assumptions about other people in the community and so forth. And I think it's important to be accepting of whatever comes up, and certainly not to get into a kind of political dialogue with somebody that can be counterproductive. If you're not sure something happened, again, probably don't push too far. Maybe there's somebody else you can ask, but you could just mirror the last word that they said. Often you said Tuesday, and then they might go, no, actually, no, it wasn't a Tuesday. I think it could have been a Monday. So it's a very gentle way of seeing if something's accurate. All of these things are easier if there's prior preparation. So if you explain to somebody before an interview that you've got a certain process as an investigative journalist, there are a few things that you might need to pick up on, please expect me to ask some questions that might re-go over things. It's easier to fact check later on if you need to. So we already talked about this, I think. Try and paint people in with all their real complexity. And I think certainly when we're talking about sexual violence, it's good to steer away from a language that implies continuing ruination. We know that sexual violence is extremely damaging and it can make big changes to people's life, future life courses. But when people read that language in stories about them as individuals, it can retard their recovery in different ways and make it harder to move forward as well. And the last thing, I should really want to talk about is, please don't underestimate the kind of all the complicated, difficult, tricky, emotional weather this kind of stuff throws up. So if we're sitting in a chair opposite somebody who's had terrible experiences, and those experiences are connected to the feelings of shame and guilt, then it's quite likely that we as journalists or filmmakers are going to pick up some of those feelings. And if we try and suppress that and push that away without considering it and acknowledging the impact, that can actually make things worse. We can find ourselves in places where we actually subconsciously don't want to listen to the person anymore. We can become less accepting. Or alternately, we can get pulled into wanting to offer certain kinds of help that we can't offer. So Lauren talked about following up with people, which is really good practice, and that maybe there are small ways of helping. But if a journalist, as a journalist, you ever find yourself straying into the kind of pseudo-therapy zone, thinking that I can help somehow with this person's emotional suffering, then that's really, really dangerous, because it's highly unlikely you have the skills to do that. And of course, what happens is you can build up a relationship of dependency and trust. And then when you're no longer in contact with that person, then the feelings of betrayal can be much more powerful. So we haven't got time to talk in lots of detail about self-care because it's beyond the scope of this essay. And maybe it's something that we can think about more for another seminar. But those are sorts of things that we all need to be kind of keeping a watch on. So efficacy, it's really empowering to do jobs well, and we get dopamine when we achieve targets and we put things in on time and so forth. And that's a kind of fantastic thing. But that sense of efficacy can rapidly diminish if we're taking on too much work and we're working too much and getting kind of tired and exhausted. Ease in the body, are we getting really kind of tense, finding it hard to relax? That can be a sign that we're having difficulty in digesting the aversive emotional content that we're working with. The more physically relaxed we are, the more headspace we have to recalibrate our emotions as well. Connection. So trauma is very isolating. We talked about how survivors of sexual violence feel isolated, scared about sharing experiences with other people. But trauma is a biopsychosocial experience, and so fostering nurturing relationships, game planning issues with your team, looking for social support outside of work and inside of work, really important for journalistic resilience and meaning. If you have ethical dilemmas, then work through them. Try and find ways of reaching out to other colleagues and thinking about how to game plan particular issues so that a sense of kind of meaning and purpose is retained in our reporting. It's really important. So we talked about activists. I think this also applies to journalists, that you can put out you can change the words to suit your own orientation. But looking after ourselves makes us more effective at work. And it's really important when we're working with such heavy topics. You can see that as an act of political warfare or as an act of maintaining the mission of high quality journalism. It doesn't really matter. And that's the last one. You wouldn't let this happen to your phone. Please don't happen to you either. Self-care is a priority, not a luxury. So I rattled through that a bit fast. I hope that was useful.
That was great. Thanks, Gavin. I think there were some really complimentary presentations from the three of you. So they really seamlessly led from one end to the other, and we had really different aspects of on this issue. We've got a good 10 minutes left, I think. So I'm not going to say much more. I'm going to get Emily to go straight into the questions. I can see there are some. So, Emily, do you want to moderate them?
Thank you. And thanks for those presentations. I think it's such a difficult subject, but you guys are doing really amazing work. So it's great to hear from you all. So we have quite a lot of questions and not a lot of time, but the first one is for Lauren. And so the question is, in feminist activism, there's been a steady trend to use the word sexualized instead of sexual when it comes to violence. Are there any discussions between journalists, feminist scholars, or activists to ensure more survivor-sensitive coverage of such crimes?
Yeah, you probably heard me saying sexualized. That was something that Gloria Steinem, when I was founding the Women Under Siege project, that she asked that I do. And she explained it by saying that this is violence. And, you know, in order to put the emphasis on violence, you're sort of describing that violence as sexualized. It's not actually like sex. I think she just wanted to make that distinction a little more clear. I've used it in The Guardian in like different outlets, and my editors never say anything. So I don't know, there's not much of a conversation. It's just kind of either or at this point.
Thank you. And this is for Alex. It's kind of a broad question, and I guess it depends what country you're reporting in, but are there any available statistics on the different forms of sexual violence? And is there kind of any trends that you can see from that data?
Well, that's an excellent question, and thank you very much for asking it. The basic answer is no. There aren't, because other forms of sexual violence or sexualized violence, not being rape, is a form of violence that is very, very first misunderstood and completely underreported. And so if you're trying to find statistics about those forms of violence, you could, but it's very sparse. It's not centralized, and it will never give you a complete image, unfortunately. So that is something that really needs to be worked on, to have that data in a centralized manner. Emily, since I have the floor, and I know that the time is very short, just a tidbit that I just have to share with you all, and let me share my screen. My colleague, 6 minutes before the start of this conference, was on a treadmill in Montana watching CNN when this popped up, and it's just such an amazing timing, I feel. This is CNN, excuse the grainy picture, CNN exclusive. CNN travels with investigators going door to door in Ukraine looking to talk to survivors of sexual violence. Now, the reason that I would just want to share this with you is that I don't want to make any assumptions, but the way that this is stated and put makes me wonder if all the points that Lauren and Gavin and all the preparation work have been actually done. So this was aired 1 hour ago on CNN. And not to say that this is an issue that is true with journalists only, it's very true for NGO colleagues of mine, investigators, prosecutors, you name it. So I'm sorry for hijacking that little Q&A, Emily, back to you.
Thank you. We don't have that much time for questions, so this will be my last question for Gavin. Somebody asked in the chat about whether when you investigate sexual violence, what the kind of protocol is in terms of talking to the police, or whether the way that you would deal with that as a journalist, because obviously it is a crime, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, well, that's really complicated, isn't it? I mean, certainly in order to get context and understand the situation, you want to be having conversations with everybody, including prosecutors. But then whether you actually want to be having a conversation about individual people is moot. I mean, it depends a bit if you're working on an agreed process in which somebody's bringing a complaint and knows that you're talking to the police and they understand what's going on the prosecution as well. I mean, one of the things that seems to be happening at the moment in Ukraine is that a lot of journalists are working with an intention to gathering evidence that's not just material that use in their reports, but can be used for future prosecutions. And this is a kind of new, never happened before to anywhere else in the world, to the extent that it's happening now. And so there are all kinds of questions about evidence chain and keeping information in a way that's safe and how that gets passed on to. So I'm not going to give a quick and easy answer to it, but to say that this is definitely something that fits the category of preparation, and to have a really kind of hard think about what one's trying to do on a particular story and how it fits into other pieces, and find out what other, if it's a Ukraine related story, for example, finding out what other networks of investigative journalists who are starting to pull apart these very tangled issues. And one difficulty, I think, is also about managing expectations, because often people want justice and they want the evidence collected, and they can often be very happy to talk to to people if they feel that that's going to happen further down the line? And are we as journalists making promises that we can't fulfill? Or are actually we do an incredibly important job in making those prosecutions more likely?
And that actually was something that happened this summer for me. People handed me documents, Russian documents that were left behind, and I had to say to them, "You've got to keep the chain of custody from breaking. You know, you have to put it at your house until you take it to the prosecutor's office. Don't let anyone touch it," that kind of thing. And I actually worked to help get documents over to the ICC and, you know, the national prosecutor. So this is something that comes up, and you do have to figure out how to deal with it, you know.
That actually, I'm just going to jump in now. What was a question that's really close to my heart that I wanted to ask. If there are journalists who do want to make sure that they follow the chain of custody and that they work in a way that can enable a war crimes prosecution, and maybe not their entire work is dedicated towards it, but they want to allow for that, where are they able to find advice, these journalists? Where can they turn to?
I mean, I've built up sources who are, you know, ICC investigator, lawyers who are at the criminal tribunals for Rwanda, Yugoslavia. So I just go with my sources. I don't know if someone can answer kind of a bigger resource.
Maybe for the International Criminal Court, for example, they have resources that indicate what their needs are in terms of when you submit information. And then true for the International Criminal Court or any other justice mechanism, talk to the war crimes investigator, reach out to them and understand very well what their exact needs are before you start indeed trying to gather evidence or sustain evidence or etc. Because you might unfortunately get it wrong. The threshold is very high usually for especially war crimes investigations.
Yeah, I think this is a great topic for a long discussion or a workshop at GIJN conference or some kind of tip sheet or something. Yeah, I think it's needed, something on this, definitely.
Yeah, it strikes me. I mean, it feels like it falls into the do no harm, nearly into that category, like a very different aspect of not doing harm. So, Emily, if there's nothing else from you, then I think that's a good point to wrap up. Gavin, you just said we are in need of more webinars, and I know that, as I said in the beginning, this is one of a series of webinars that GIJN is organizing on the topic of war crimes. So there will be more coming. As I said before, the resources that are going to be put together, if you have signed up for this recording, you'll get them as an email in your inbox. And before I say goodbye, I would like to thank everybody. That's Gavin Rees, Alex Villeneuve, and Lauren Wolf. Thank you for putting together such amazing and really practically useful material. And then also, of course, to the team from GIJN who've done the research and found such an amazing team of speakers, which is not an easy thing to do. So all the care and thought that's gone into putting this event together. Thank you very much to everybody. And we've run out of time, so this is goodbye.